My name is Marc Schmidt. I'm the founder and principal at Schema Design. And I'm actually half German and half American, if you couldn't tell by the name, which of course these days is a topic in and of itself. But I actually grew up near Hamburg and then later moved to the United States. And for the last, gosh, I don't know, 13 years, I've been living here in Seattle. Coming to you from Seattle today, slightly bleary-eyed, but nonetheless. And so with this background, I really grew up with a very specific sense of design: precise, logical, minimal, and ideally no color. So before Schema, I spent some time at these three places, at IDEO, Pentagram, and Microsoft. And each place taught me something a little different about research, in the case of IDEO, craft in the case of Pentagram. And at Microsoft, I learned a thing or two about product. But eventually, I wanted to take what I'd learned and really build something of my own. So I started Schema. It's been over 12 years now. And back in the day, I, believe it or not, didn't really set out to run a business. I think like many of us maybe going through this, at the time, I just wanted to do good work and I wanted to do it on my own terms. But of course, it didn't quite turn out that way. Because as I found, if you want to keep doing the work that you love, you end up really having to build a business around it. And so that's really what I want to talk about today: where we've been over the last 12 plus years, what we've learned, and where we might be headed next. So let's dive in. How we've evolved. The only constant in this work, this may sound a little cliche, but the only constant is change. Really, that's what I found, that there's always new tools, new expectations, new ways of working. And so if you're running a business, you have to constantly be adapting, or you will get left behind. So at Schema, we've had to reinvent ourselves many times. And a lot of the time, it actually felt like we were sort of figuring it out as we went along. But of course, in hindsight, looking back, you then realize that maybe there was a pattern here. And I actually think that there were 5 moments, 5 inflection points really for us that really ended up shaping our trajectory and our work. So I wanted to talk about those now. The first is mainstreaming data. When I was in school, first at Parsons and then later at Yale, Edward Tufte was everywhere. And so back in this time, it was all about paring down, getting rid of anything unnecessary, just showing the data. And that mindset really did shape how I thought about design in those early days. And it actually guided me through school. But then came Hans Rosling and Gapminder in 2006 at TED. And suddenly, it seemed like data could be emotional, it could be persuasive, and it could tell a story. It could actually make you feel something. And that, to me, was a major inflection point. And it's, in my mind, really the moment that data visualization went mainstream. So around this time, I was actually at Pentagram back in those days, and I had started experimenting with data in more expressive ways. And Invisible Cities was actually one of my very first projects. It was actually a collaboration with the artist Lee J. Shah. And this is a project that visualized geocoded social data in real time. Tweets and Instagram photos basically mapped to a topography of the city. And so you had social activity streaming in real time. You also had the terrain changing, kind of warping over time based on data density. And so this project was really, I think, one of my very first attempts at designing interfaces where the visualization itself became the metaphor. And you'll maybe see that as a theme in some of the later work that I'm going to show. So then fast forward to 2012, when I started Schema. Big data was the buzzword of the time. And the default response really for most organizations was dashboards. Dashboards over and over. And actually, people kept asking me back in those days, how are you different from Tableau? this is where we started, right? Having to answer that question time and time again. And of course, it was really the wrong question to ask, because we weren't trying to compete with Tableau. We were building custom tools, right? Focused on, not on productivity, but really on knowledge creation. And these were tools that were built for specific audiences, specific data sets, specific data models. So having to address that question time and time again, it really made that distinction very clear in our minds and very core to our work. So exploration. And one of our first projects at Schema was Legislative Explorer, which visualizes how bills move through Congress. And this was, at the time, it was commissioned by the University of Washington. And it was a project that made a very complex process, right? The process of legislation, visible and explorable. It also reinforced our early belief at Schema that if you can create tools for data exploration, then these tools can really shape understanding. Over a decade later now, we're actually still maintaining this tool. And in fact, last year, we were approached by the client, John Wilkerson, professor at UW, who asked if we would bring it in-house. And so we did. We took it over, and we're continuing to maintain it now in somewhat tumultuous times. So then by the mid-2010s, the field started to shift once again. And this time it was shifting more towards explanation, towards storytelling. Clients wanted no longer dashboards, they now wanted narratives. And so we started seeing more scrollytelling, which, obviously long form data stories with an arc, with a narrative arc and an editorial point of view. We started seeing more and more of this kind of work. And so we ourselves also began doing more narrative work, which then pushed us to really think beyond tools, beyond charts and graphs, and more around storytelling, content strategy, writing, and narrative design. So here's a project from that era. This was done with Google, Alberto Cairo, and Axios in collaboration. And it's a project called Searching COVID-19 that visualizes how people searched for answers during the early months of the pandemic. And so here we organize search data by topic and by intent, how to versus what is queries. And so we were able to show for a succession of several months how public perception shifted from confusion in the early days to resignation and adaptation. So I think, for me, this project really made visible not just what people searched for, but why. And so it captured, I think, in a way, the zeitgeist of the time and what we were all experiencing, a kind of shared collective anxiety. And then around the pandemic, our work once again started to evolve, this time towards data experiences. And these were interfaces where content and data came together really in a unified way, in an integrated way. And so we started thinking more broadly about how structure and story could coexist, how exploration on the one hand could lead to insights, and then insights once again could invite deeper exploration. And so that shift for us really started to come into focus with some of the work that we did for Bloomberg at the time. And actually, since 2018, we've worked with Bloomberg on a series of data activations for the New Economy Forum. And so each year that we were brought in, we created large-scale visualizations for topics like climate change, global trade, inequality, and many others for this global conference. And so I really do think of these as data experiences. They were, in essence, integrated narratives, telling a story through visuals, and ultimately providing context for the event, but also on a more visceral level, really helping people connect with the issues that were being discussed. And that really brings me all the way up to the present day, to today. And I think we're right now at another inflection point. The next shift is happening right at this moment, and it's towards systems that will synthesize data and that will actually think with us. Mm. And of course, I'm talking about AI. And we think that with AI, our first of all, our role as designers is changing, so we have to rethink what we do and how we work. But also there's an opportunity to really shape the interface between human and machine intelligence. And that's what we're focused on today. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But first, what have we learned? Schema has always been small, right? We've oscillated somewhere around 8 to maybe 16, 17 people. And that's worked for us. But like with any business, there's actually a natural pressure to grow. So I want to talk about that for a moment. This notion of growth in a creative practice, which is actually tricky. It's not easy. And that's because it's not really about size at the end of the day. It's about staying true to the work. So let's unpack that. In the early days of Schema, I didn't realize how soon I would have to start delegating. But the more work that we took on, and we grew organically, always, the more work that we took on, the more my focus shifted, right? From designing projects to ultimately designing the business. And that, in effect, meant designing systems. So I needed to delegate. And it's really around that time that I started learning, that I learned my first big lesson, which is every business leans towards growth. Every business leans towards growth. But growth doesn't just happen. It's shaped by external and internal pressures. Right, you've got clients on the one hand. Clients want scale, they want continuity. And ultimately, it's a form of risk mitigation that sort of puts the pressure on to grow. At the same time, your team also wants opportunities to grow in their craft, to grow in their careers. And so that too creates a certain pressure to scale up, to grow. And as long as you can ride that wave, things mostly do fall into place. But then, growth at the same time is, like I said, it's tricky. When I started Schema, everyone warned me scaling a services business is really hard. And they were right. It is hard. It often feels like you're fighting a battle on 3 fronts. There's projects, right? You're always working to bring in new projects, sometimes through competitive proposals, through, at times, existing relationships, as I'm sure we're all aware. But the reality is that it takes an ongoing effort, right? This is never over. You always have to keep the pipeline filled. And you need people. You need good people to do the work, which means finding the right people, hiring, mentoring, pairing the right people with the right projects. And many designers also, as I found, aren't initially trained to work with data. So you need to create a culture also that encourages learning, experimentation, and collaboration. And then assuming that you've got the projects and the people, you still need the ability to execute. We really learned this, I think, in some ways the hard way in the early days of Schema. And it's also, process is also never something that is over. You're always honing your process. You're always trying to find a balance between ensuring some degree of consistency, repeatability, but also not letting go of creative freedom and giving people enough flexibility to still work their ideas into the work. So balancing projects, people, and process, that's really what it takes to grow a creative business. And that's what makes it also so challenging. But there is one model that has guided how I think about our work and how I think about scaling a business like ours. And it's actually surprisingly simple. We make and we learn, and that's it. That's it. It's a loop. One feeds the other. And it's tempting to think about, especially in hindsight, to sort of think about your trajectory as a company as a linear path. But in reality, I think we all know this, it's not like that. It's cyclical, and it's iterative, and it's organic. And that's really what this model attempts to capture. It's a constant process of making and learning. The cycle starts by reframing the brief. You help clients see the real problem, not just the one they came with. It also involves collaboration, like we discussed a moment ago, building trust and structure so that people can work well together in teams, which is actually one of the hardest things to do. And it's driven by innovation, which I think is an important point as well. You always have to push yourself to innovate, not for its own sake, not for newness sake, but ultimately to achieve a better quality of work, which for me, and this is probably a whole nother talk, is ultimately comes back to simplicity. And then on the learn arc, it's about standardization, standardizing what works so it can be repeated, refined, and improved. Strategizing based on experience, right? So based on the projects and what we've learned, figuring out where we're headed as a company, and then finding out how we communicate that more broadly to our partners, to our clients, and to our team, so that the outside world doesn't define it for us. And that's it. That's the model: make, learn, repeat. And of course, this make-learn cycle doesn't lead to maybe explosive growth, but we're also not chasing scale the way that a startup might. But what it does build over time is perspective. And this is what I think of as really our true value as a design firm. We don't scale vertically, we stretch. We stretch across industries, across organizations, challenges, domains. And that is what lets us see patterns and what lets us connect the dots, and also help others maybe navigate what might be next. So let's talk about what's next. Like I said before, I think that we're entering a new phase, and that's due to AI and LLMs and diffusion models, and how they are changing the way that we ultimately engage with information and how we make sense of it. And so as information designers, I think that we have a role to play in this, a critical role, in fact, to shape the systems that help people think with data. And so we call these systems intelligent interfaces, which will empower exploration. They'll help people basically investigate complex questions and form hypotheses about the world. They'll guide analysis. They'll help people find relevant data, maybe in support of or challenging the hypothesis that they came in with. From there, insights can be formed through synthesis, data synthesized, maybe proposing possible answers to the initial questions. And then those insights are shared and disseminated. And so this is how knowledge expands. So we call this framework the figure 8. It's really derived more from the scientific process, and it reflects a lot of our thinking from over the years and how we've sort of approached our projects. But like I said, there's an opportunity here for a synergy between human and machine intelligence. The left side of the figure 8 is really about the structure of information. So it's rooted in science and rational thought, and this is really the space for AI, where AI fits in. On the right-hand side is meaning, and this is ultimately about creativity, about context and human connection. So this is where we come in, turning data into stories, creating stories that resonate, that make sense to people, and that really connect. So we think that we need a new generation of tools that can help us make sense of our increasingly complex and data-driven world. Now, what might those interfaces look like? Over the last 2+ years, we've been thinking a lot about that, and through our client work, through our self-initiated work, we've started exploring this space, and even though it's early days, some patterns are starting to emerge. And so I wanted to conclude with 3 areas that I think hold real potential for us in this space. The first area is knowledge graphs. Many organizations are sitting on huge amounts of unstructured information. And now through AI, we can create knowledge graphs that can connect all this information and actually surface patterns and relationships and outliers. And they can actually end up turning a lot of this siloed content into a network of meaning that can make it easier for people to search, explore, and build on all of this data. The second area is what we've come to think about as adaptive landscapes, which are, we think of these really as generative interfaces for discovery. And they visualize basically a solution space of sorts, which is a dynamic terrain, a landscape that is constantly reshaped through user intent and also through AI. And so as people explore, the landscape changes and shifts to show new perspectives and connections. And it really gives form to complexity through a universal metaphor, a little like invisible cities that I shared a moment ago. And finally, spatial computing. I think this is going to be a big topic as well, and AI and AR are clearly on a collision course. This is still very much in the early days as well, but the result will be interfaces that will be embedded in the world around us. And this is where we think we're headed. Immersive, intelligent tools and interfaces that ultimately blend the physical and the digital, and that will really help us see our world and our data in entirely new ways. Thank you.